Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ITIF's webinar, How AR/VR Can Help Expand Apprenticeship Programs. My name is Juan Londoño. I am ITIF's Augmented and Virtual Reality Policy Analyst. And today I have a privilege to be alongside an amazing group of panelists and speakers. Apprenticeships, with their on-the-job training and hands-on experience, have provided a valuable alternative to traditional classroom-based educational programs. Apprenticeship programs have grown continuously in the last 20 years in the United States, with significant support from leaders in both government and industry as an effective method to train and develop the workforce of the future. But as demand for these programs increases, the government must figure out a way to scale and grow these programs in a safe, cost-efficient manner. The success of augmented and virtual reality technology, both in classrooms and in factories, shows that these technologies could catalyze the growth of apprenticeship programs. But introducing new technologies, especially emerging tech like AR/VR, is not a seamless process. Businesses face all sorts of challenges and barriers that could deter them from adopting the tech. Solving this puzzle will be key as we look to expand apprenticeship programs and increase their effectiveness. Before we kick off the discussion, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Representative Lisa Blunt Rochester. Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester sits on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, where she's a leading voice in Congress on economic and future of work-related issues. As a former Secretary of Labor and State Personnel Director, a co-chair of the New Democrat Coalition's Future of Work Task Force, and the founder of the Congressional Future of Work Caucus, she knows workforce issues well, and we're delighted to have her with us today. The Congresswoman has prepared a pre-recorded keynote speech for us.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester, and it is my pleasure to join you for the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation's virtual forum on how augmented and virtual reality can help expand apprenticeship programs. As Delaware's former Secretary of Labor, Head of State Personnel, and CEO of the Metropolitan Wilmington Urban League, I've spent much of my career thinking about the world of work. What work looks like, past, present, future. How we can create good paying jobs and support entrepreneurs. And how we prepare people to step into these jobs. That's why I'm so excited to join all of you today to discuss what I believe will be a key tool in the future of job training and skills development, and ultimately in improving our way of life and strengthening our economy. And as the co-chair of the Bipartisan Future of Work Caucus in Congress, I'm always looking for ways to move our country and economy forward. As a nation, we're facing a significant workforce preparedness problem, one that is not new, but surely has been exacerbated by the pandemic, and now poses a greater threat to our future prosperity and competitiveness. But let's be clear, Congress has done some remarkable work over the past few years to kickstart our economy in the wake of the pandemic and create job opportunities. Landmark legislation like the CHIPS and Science Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act are making historic investments that will create hundreds of thousands of good-paying jobs. The efforts of Congress and the Biden administration have led to the 2 strongest years of job creation in our nation's history and the lowest unemployment rate in half a century. And while creating these jobs is critical, so is ensuring we have the workforce to fill them. We know there are still 3.5 million workers missing from the workforce. Put simply, we have more job openings than qualified candidates looking for work. While we know these issues, such as there are other issues such as affordable and accessible caregiving that present challenges, we also know without thoughtful workforce development strategies, many Americans who want to work but haven't been equipped with the skills needed for new roles may be unable to take full advantage of the jobs created. And having a prepared and skilled workforce isn't just good for individuals and families, it's good for all of us. It means we can compete on a global scale. But before we can truly unleash our economic potential, we have to solve our labor workforce shortage problem. We must ask ourselves, how do we train workers who wouldn't traditionally have access to quality job training programs in a way that may be cheaper, safer, and better. One answer to this question is virtual and augmented reality training models. Due to the highly transportable and adaptive nature of this technology, these programs are able to reach communities everywhere: urban, suburban, rural, and in Delaware, coastal. Folks from different backgrounds and skill levels. AR and VR models can be a cost-effective solution. Less expensive startup and equipment costs are also possible. When training accidents do occur, they don't result in wasted supplies and trainees not being able to get started again. It might cost less money just to repeat the activities that they did. I was able to visit a welding class in Delaware, and I can tell you it was much safer for everybody in the building and for everybody around me that I was using virtual tools. The AR and VR models are safer. And finally, VR is actually fun. The studies have shown time and again that when people are having fun, they tend to retain knowledge and information better. Learning in a realistic environment where you can simulate action and visualize yourself in the role is more engaging and inspiring to workers than many traditional training methods. The possibilities this technology creates for our workforce led me to develop and introduce a bill at the end of last Congress called the Immersive Technology for the American Workforce Act. This bill would leverage immersive technologies like virtual and augmented reality in workforce training programs at community colleges and career and technical education programs. By utilizing these technologies, programs can reduce the capital and equipment costs of high-skilled training programs and expand access to workers in rural and underserved areas. To ensure our economy is strong, vibrant, and internationally competitive, we must utilize the innovative and technological advancements that we have helped make possible. That is why I am planning on introducing this bill again, working across the aisle with my friend and colleague, Tim Walberg. We will be introducing this to ensure that AR and VR training programs are available throughout the United States. We've already seen the real-world impacts of these programs, and they're being utilized in diverse contexts, from Boeing to Delaware Technical and Community College to Christiana Care, our healthcare system. And we're just getting started. Together, we can build the job training programs of the future, and together, we can unleash the full potential of our country. Thanks for being on this virtual journey with us, and please enjoy the rest of the seminar.
I want to thank the Congresswoman for preparing this fantastic keynote speech for us. Now, let's kick off that discussion. I would like to introduce our four panelists for today. So joining us today, we have Amanda Longtain. Amanda is the Director of Economic Development at Transfer Inc. Amanda is a 17-year educator from Austin, Texas, with a master's degree in adult education, who has used secondary education, post-secondary education, and workforce development as a lever to ensure that all learners, no matter their zip code, gets access to high-quality education and training programs that lead to upward mobility. We also have Shailene Yutishi. Shailene is a Senior Program Manager at Burning Glass Institute. Shailene is also a non-resident fellow at the World Economic Forum and at New America. He's also a Forbes contributor covering workforce and education innovation. We also have Christopher Bybee. Christopher is the Senior Director of Strategic Growth at Interplay Learning. He holds a bachelor's degrees in business honors and finance from Texas A&M University. Last but not least, we have Alicia Purile. Alicia is a legislative assistant for Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester and oversees the economics and financial services portfolio that includes education, labor, and workforce topics. In this role, she supports the Congresswoman's leadership on the future of work. Before we start the panel discussion, I want to remind all of those watching the webinar to subscribe to ITIF's YouTube channel and to turn on notifications so you never miss an event. Also, you can submit your questions using the Slido link, which can be found below in the video in the YouTube description, or the video on our ITIF webpage. So I would like to start off with a question for Amanda Longtain. Amanda, Transfer has found success in the immersive learning space, helping different companies provide on-the-job training with immersive tools. What would you say sets immersive learning apart from traditional in-person training? And how has immersive learning expanded the training capabilities of businesses?
Yes, thank you so much. And it's an honor to be here. If you don't mind, I'm going to tackle this from a little bit of a different angle. So, the first thing to recognize is that career exploration and navigation is incredibly important. And so, when we talk about the immersive environment that virtual reality offers, we are really enabling learners to make an informed decision about what's next. That is a huge value for employers. It tackles enrollment, it tackles retention, and it really tackles upward mobility. And so at Transfer, we were really focused on that first intersection, again, exploration and navigation. And then we also focus on the actual training. And what we have found is that that training can be used in dual credit classrooms across the United States to really utilize virtual reality to offer those high quality work-based learning experiences. Very much like the Congresswoman mentioned, we can take this technology anywhere. And so, by offering those high quality work based learning experiences, we are tackling these issues from a variety of angles. Not only are we getting middle schoolers excited and high schoolers excited, we're offering those immersive environments via work based learning opportunities, no matter your zip code. So, if you are living in a rural part of the United States, you're living in a hyper urban city like Austin, the high quality education doesn't change. And that is another really significant piece of what we do at Transfer and just VR in general, is that it really offers a standardized experience, right? And so the quality of instruction doesn't change. The other thing that is significant is that it really increases a person's intrinsic motivation, which is what pushes us forward, what gets us excited. And so when you transport a learner and put them in this safe environment, not only are we doing great things like saving on consumables and really promoting safety and ensuring that our learners know what PPE is, right? So in turn, that saves a lot of money. But it's that confidence building piece that we have found really moves the needle. And so when that learner is transported to that environment, they can try and try again until they get it right. We have a digital coach inside of our headset. His name is Simon. He never changes his tonality. He doesn't get frustrated. He just encourages that learner to try until they get it right. And we have found that that is one of the biggest values, especially for businesses. When you have a learner that comes to you, whether you are opportunity youth or whether you are an adult, if you have confidence, imagine what that feels like when you're presenting your skills and your competencies to that employer. So that is a huge value. Not only are you making an informed decision about what's next, you are standing with confidence and pride. And that transferability of skills is something that is really powerful. And so, yes, there's tons of tangibility around, again, the saving around consumables, the saving around how quickly these technologies change, how quickly our businesses change. And so, obviously, being able to tweak things in the VR space is significantly easier than building a brand new facility. And so that value is inherent. But what gets me really excited as that 17-year educator, someone who's worked in schools, someone who's worked in colleges, is again that confidence and being able to get our learners ready to take that next step, have those informed discussions, and feel good about what they're offering that prospective employer.
Thank you, Benda. Next, I would like to ask Shailene a question. Shailene, AR/VR tech has shown tremendous promise in the educational space, as it seems it can make trainers safer and more cost efficient, as we've seen. Yet, the technology has yet to become ubiquitous, and some businesses seem to be skeptical of adopting it. What do you think could be? Like, what do you think are the key barriers and challenges that could deter businesses from adopting immersive tools?
Juan, I think this is a really great question. And I just loved Amanda's overview of just different use cases for AR, VR, especially career exploration and career navigation, which we're finding from our analyses at Burning Glass Institute is actually quite a pain point for many learners, as well as many workers as they move on later in their careers. When it comes to the topic of adopting AR, VR in the employer environment, a couple of points come to mind based on some work that we have done. I'll name some of the obvious points first. The cost might be prohibitive. AR, VR technology is more expensive perhaps than other enterprise technologies, which may deter employers from investing in it, especially if they don't see an immediate return on investment. In this era of Chat GPT and AGI, there are lots of different directions in which CTOs and CEOs are being pulled in to undergo digital transformation. I think to that point, many employers I found just don't really understand the full utility of AR, VR. There's a need to do more education in the business community and in the I think CHRO community as well about the potential benefits that AR, VR offers. Business leaders may have an outdated perspective on the capabilities of AR, VR, maybe thinking back to Oculus days when that was quite vogue. I also think, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention as a education and labor analyst, I think there are concerns about employee productivity or upskilling that would be required to have employees be effective in using AR, VR. Many employers and many workers are still grappling with fundamental digital skills, cybersecurity practices. Heck, knowing how to share a calendar, an Outlook, or navigating Zoom is still a challenge for lots of employers, junior and senior. Some employers may see AR, VR skilling to just be so daunting, or maybe putting the cart before the horse in their workforce development strategy for their firm when they're undergoing digital transformation. Two other points that I come to mind for me is I increasingly think that there's concerns of data privacy and security concerns. AR, VR tech may be perceived as requiring sensitive data to be collected or stored, whether personal or proprietary, right? It could be the worker perspective or the employer perspective here, which can raise concerns about data privacy and security breaches. In the education space, this is a barrier even in something as simple as collecting earnings and outcomes data from student records. Certain states prohibit that. And the last point that comes to mind for me in terms of barriers or perhaps perception of health and safety risks in this era of still present Zoom fatigue and mental health strains, especially among our learners. AR, VR tech may be perceived as being uncomfortable or even causing health issues, motion sickness, eye strain, which could adopt employers from adopting it, or lead to workers perhaps resisting it. Despite layoffs in tech and headlines of, maybe return to office to the chagrin of workers or recession murmurs, the labor market is still pretty tight, as the representative mentioned in her comments. There's strong evidence that employers are wary of doing things that will lead to quit rates going up. And I suspect that it's contributing to the lack of accelerated adoption of AR, VR tech as well. So those are some barriers that come to mind, and I'm excited to talk about the solutions to some of those. Thank you, Juan.
Thank you so much, Shailene. So I would like to move on and talk to Christopher. Christopher, Interplay just launched its new Department of Labor approved apprenticeship program that incorporates immersive learning tools. Can you talk a little bit more about the process of structuring this program and obtaining that approval from DOL? What do you think are the wrinkles can be ironed out with policy to expand the adoption of immersive learning tools in educational sphere?
Yeah, thanks, Juan, and thank you for having us on the panel. It's an honor. So as you mentioned, Interplay is proud to now be a DOL-approved apprenticeship provider. And just to provide a little context there, so we serve the trades at large, so training electricians, plumbers, HVAC technicians. And obviously, apprenticeship has been a core part of the trades for a long time, and the unions and industry associations do it really well. But what we realized was that a lot of small to mid-sized businesses struggled a little bit to get involved with apprenticeship, whether it was a geographic constraint, a cost constraint, or simply a complexity constraint. We heard over and over from some of these smaller to mid-sized businesses that, man, I wish I could set up these programs, but I just don't know how. And so with our curriculum and our content we've built, we worked closely with the Department of Labor to explore if we could set up a program where we would actually manage the related technical instruction or the classroom portion of apprenticeship and allow our employer partners to actually do the on-the-job training. And the DOL was fantastic in helping us to really organize our content around the different tasks that someone has to do in the field to earn that credential. And we're now excited to have 4 different programs, 1 in HVAC, 1 in plumbing, and 2 in electrical, where, again, we serve the classroom training portion and the employers really power the on-the-job training. And it's been cool to see. We now have 16 companies who are utilizing this and over 60 apprentices. And so we're able to support those small and mid-sized businesses that way, while also now working closely with some of those larger organizations like unions, like trade associations, where we just simply add on to their existing curriculum. And that's taken form at places like the Associated and Builders and Contractors Group in Michigan, as well as the College of Western Idaho. So that's a little bit about the structure, Juan. And then to take your second question, what are some of the wrinkles that we can iron out here to really drive adoption of this technology? I think Shailene, you described it really well, a lot of these challenges, and I would just piggyback on what you said. I think the 2 biggest things that we are focused on ironing out, if you will, one is reducing friction. VR has come a long way in the steps that companies like Meta have made to really reduce the friction it takes to get into the headset. But fundamentally, we're still asking people, especially small to mid-sized contractors, to add steps to their day, to log into a headset, to put on the headset, to train in the headset. And so, regardless of what you're asking someone to add into their day, there's going to be a little bit of time it takes to get used to that friction. And so we're really fortunate to have partnered with Meta to actually take some of their headsets and give it to some of these small to mid-sized contractors to really understand what are those friction points and how can we together prove out the use case further. The second point is really just building trust and confidence. Apprenticeship and training has been done a certain way for a long time, and that's worked really well for contractors and the trades as a whole. And so I think building stories around how this immersive technology can accelerate learning, it can be a nice complement to traditional ways of learning, can really begin to instill confidence in these contractors to say, okay, yeah, I'm open to this. So those are probably the 2 biggest wrinkles that we're focused on.
Thank you, Christopher. And now to close this first open round, Alicia, I want to ask you. So Representative Blunt Rochester just recently introduced initiatives for workforce modernization, particularly as we saw in the keynote, the introduction of immersive technologies at educational institutions like community college or vocational schools. So in general, what role does your office and the representative's office see for the federal government in that push for the adoption of immersive technology in education? Where can it be the most effective to catalyze that change?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm just speaking for myself here. I think that a key, role of the federal government is to help solve problems that occur at a large scale and problems that can't be solved by the individual. And the workforce shortage and the workforce preparedness problem is an example of this. So VR and AR technologies offer a tool to help address this problem and to help overcome this problem so that as a country, we can reach our long-term goals and our current goals that require a robust and prepared workforce. And I think that the VR and AR technologies, as you've heard from the other panelists and from the Congresswoman, that it has a lot to offer in this space. It can be safer, it can be cost-effective, and it's certainly scalable. And so this is an innovative way to address this larger social problem. but it's not the only tool that we'll have to use to achieve the goals. And I think another key point about it is that it can expand access. And so we want to build as inclusive a workforce as possible as we're moving forward. And the ability of these technologies to be used from someone's living room to a rural classroom, and folks that don't necessarily have access to the best workforce training tools or centers can still be brought into the workforce and receive really meaningful and high-level training.
Thank you, Alicia. So I actually wanted to ask you something else, and something you mentioned, the Congresswoman mentioned too. It's like the importance of access and like bringing this technology and immersive learning programs to different areas that were not available before. So like AR/VR learning programs have that potential to take in remote learning to that next level, where like one instructor can supervise the work of multiple students at the same time, and that could help extend the coverage of this apprenticeship programs to often ignored or overlooked rural areas where the logistical challenge of hosting a training program, flying someone in, reserving a space, can be very prohibitive. But at the same time, it's often these areas that also lack reliable internet connectivity and access to this support technicians if something goes wrong. So how do you think we can ensure that these tools drive equity in training programs instead of possibly broadening that digital divide that we've seen?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that we're certainly thinking about. I mean, like I said before, there's no just one approach to solve this problem. The access to broadband is a related question that there needs to be separate and continuous efforts to lessen the digital divide. There are lots of current efforts in the federal government to expand access to broadband. I think I saw a GAO report recently that there are maybe 25 federal programs specifically focused on broadband, whether it's planning and implementation and development. And I think there's over 100 or so federal programs that are in some way connected with broadband. So it's certainly an excellent point, and that continues to be an issue, from students learning on Zoom, not having reliable internet access, to someone who may be receiving a workforce training with a VR module. But I think something that also could be done is, in the interim, I do believe that some of these technologies have the capability of downloadable features. And so you wouldn't necessarily, if you could develop a potential program where you could download training that wouldn't require constant internet access. But of course, that doesn't address the larger issue of broadband, which is much needed. Yeah.
Thank you, Alicia. Like, I would like to extend Amanda and Christopher this question too. Possibly we can start with Amanda. Like, from your experience with transfer and like trying to reach out this communities that are often not very without reliable internet access, how has transfer tried to navigate those barriers and that challenge?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The digital divide in Texas in particular is quite extensive. We have over 1.2 million rural Texans who lack access to high quality broadband. So I'm sure you can just think about that writ large. The beauty of headsets is that you can actually run them off of a hotspot. So when we get in really sticky situations where we are in school districts or trainings, we definitely lean on hotspots. We also go through an entire training with our partners and really attack those barriers on the front end. And so if we are working with a school or a college, we make sure to incorporate their IT specialists. We make sure that we navigate all of the potential barriers so we can set them up for success. Obviously, during the pandemic, we got incredibly innovative. We used school buses to, drive Wi-Fi hotspots around the city. We are still doing that, and we are still leaning into the infrastructure that we were able to utilize during the pandemic. And it has been really beautiful to see what we have learned about the digital divide, especially during the pandemic. And so my hope and Transfer's hope is that those innovative solutions continue to spur new growth. And very much like Alicia said, we have the federal government tackling these issues. We have state and local governments tackling these issues. Another example is that, community college systems around the United States are these beautiful community centers. And so regardless of where you are, you can lean into your local ISD. You can show up at your local library. You can show up at your community school, and the list goes on. And so we can't forget that we have all of these existing assets in our community, and we can work hard to build these ecosystems and these intra-community ties to ensure that we are working together as a system and as a people to tackle these really complex issues. But again, the value of VR is that it's transportable, it's affordable, it's scalable, and you can run these headsets off of a Wi-Fi hotspot. But again, let's not forget about all of our existing assets. And so if we can tackle those barriers on the front end and build those intersections to ensure that we're working as a cohesive system, we can figure anything out.
Thank you, Minda. And Christopher, I want to also extend that question to you and see how Interplay has also managed to go to this hurdle.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Juan. No, I thought Amanda summarized it really well. I mean, we see similar challenges, across the U.S. and then in some of our international initiatives, even South Africa in particular, we're seeing the same issues. And I think, fundamentally, internet connectivity has to be a priority. And my hope long term is that this over time gets solved. But in the near term, where we've seen this gap be bridged, I think VR allows really any small company, any rural workforce development group to become a training center, right? Oftentimes those locations will have access to Wi-Fi. So let's take Bob's Plumbing in Waxahachie, Texas, right? The technicians at Bob's Plumbing might not have access to internet at home, but chances are, in our experience, is that at that location, there will be access to internet. And so Bob's Plumbing, that physical location, now becomes a training center in its own right because of the VR headset and the power that those headsets can offer. So that's one way. I think it's a Band-Aid solution. I think Amanda touched on it as well, partnering with these workforce development groups who have figured out ways to reach these individuals who might be in rural areas without access to internet. But there are Band-Aid solutions in the near term, but my hope long term is that as hotspots get improved, like Amanda mentioned, or simply we bridge this gap of access to broadband, this will become less and less of an issue.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Shailene, I want to pull a thread of when you mentioned about the costs of implementing these programs, and a very neat thing about immersive learning programs, they have a potential to turn that cost structure of training backwards. With a traditional training program, like each additional training session, that means the costs go up. You must pay the instructor, fly them in, reserve a space, and maybe even get new equipment. I mean, with immersive learning programs, as you mentioned, there's like a strong first investment, maybe to buy the headsets, buy some licenses, but they also this content can be accessed on demand. It doesn't require that much space, and essentially, like each training session, like amortizes that cost. So how do you think this is going to shift the incentive structure and nudge businesses probably into maximizing training hours as much as possible? And do you think has this manifested already in the business that have adopted it?
I'm so glad you asked me this question, Juan, because it's one thing I was thinking about as I was reflecting on the Congresswoman's remarks, and I completely agree. I mean, I think what needs to happen here is some education and advocacy on the value proposition and the ROI that AR/VR technologies can bring to learners and workers and working learners. I think a very interesting sort of additional policy frame for making the case for AR/VR for work-based learning or apprenticeship programs in particular is demonstrating its utility in improving working conditions or learning conditions for students and workers, ease of task, ease of learning, solving problems. There's a job quality movement afoot in Washington and across the country, led by Secretary Raimundo at Department of Commerce and Secretary Walsh and now Secretary Julie Su at Department of Labor, there's keen interest in the business community, the Business Roundtable, World Economic Forum, you name it, in unlocking job quality for more workers. And I wonder if AR/VR can be framed as part of the solution there. The Family and Workers Fund has been a key philanthropic partner in this work, working with many research organizations, including New America, where I hang a hat, in helping to think through all the different aspects of job quality for workers. And, when the Congresswoman said that AR/VR has the potential of making work more fun, that's what really spurred this thought process for me, because I think that's exactly right. I mean, we spend most of our working hours at work, waking hours at work. And, as we've seen from the malaise in labor force participation and the general sort of quiet quitting marketing phenomenon and so forth, there is an urgency in reimagining work. And I wonder if that could be part of the value proposition to spur further adoption of AR/VR tech and justify the cost for employers. Now, I think there are also practical things that can be done, capacity building grants, pilot projects spurred on by federal initiatives, state initiatives, philanthropies, I think could be a key part of the equation to help defray that initial cost that employers incur for piloting AR/VR tech. I think that would be a fascinating model. I would love to see workforce development boards pilot AR/VR adoption and some of the ETPL members, education training provider members that they work with. I think it would be fascinating to look at our manufacturing extension partnership network at Department of Commerce and see how AR/VR tech can be piloted and funded initially through some pilot grants through the NIST MEP network. I think there are practical policy solutions to address this affordability concern that some employers have. But I also think that adding the frame of AR/VR as a way of making jobs better and making workers more productive, but also more joyful in their jobs is not a non-trivial framing. We're leading a project at the World Economic Forum that is all about making workplace tech a win-win for workers and employers. And as part of that project, we've had many conversations with CHROs and CTOs and tech vendors and employers large and small about what they see as limitations for adopting workplace tech, whether it's AI based, whether it's AR/VR, whether it's much more simplistic or legacy tools in tech. And this notion of improving working conditions, I think is a very exciting frame. I think it's one that could get labor very excited. Gallup poll as of last fall showed that public support for labor in this country is at an all-time high since the 60s. I think framing AR/VR tech as a way of making work and learning more enjoyable and easier is an interesting additional dimension that we'd be able to pull upon as we continue with this work. So those are some thoughts, Juan. A little bit of a hodgepodge question answer, but I hope that helps.
Oh, thank you, Shailen. Thank you so much. I think it's a very extensive and comprehensive answer. Christopher, I wanted to bounce back to you and ask you, like, especially with your experience with welding and some of these like high risk trades. It's like new technologies can be like this disruptive force. They optimize processes, they change social norms, and move the boundary of what we think can be done. But these disruptions often manifest in tensions with certain regulations and preset standards. For example, like right now, most apprenticeship programs recognize virtual education hours as valid replacement of classroom training, but not usually for in-person training. And with your experience in this space, do you think it's feasible to think that at one point the time a student spends in immersive programs in the VR headset should count as practical training hours? Could we pull something standard-wise from like industries like aviation that have a simulator hours count as practical experience?
Yeah, thanks, Juan. No, it's a great question. I think short answer is I think eventually we could get there where some of that immersive training time could count towards those practical training hours. And I think companies like ours and others could work closely with the DOL to evaluate how that fits in. But I think the argument for those hours counting towards those practical training hours can really be boiled down to when you look at why VR training is so powerful. And in our view, it's really because you're able to condense scenarios that, in our case, a technician might see in the field, really into one training session. So just to use a practical example, an HVAC technician, they're going to see a number of different troubleshooting faults when they're troubleshooting a rooftop package unit at a commercial building. It's pretty hard to show them 20 different faults in real life out in the field, right? If you're going to do that, probably going to take 1 or 2 weeks to show them all the different faults, meaning, this wire is wrong or that wire is wrong. In the headset, we're really able to do that in, let's call it 2 hours, because you're able to show them all those scenarios in a much quicker amount of time. And so I actually think there's an argument to be had that VR training, given the amount of scenarios and reps you get, may actually be more powerful than in the field learning to some extent. That in the field learning always is going to be important, but I think the VR training can actually be a really important part of that learning process or journey, especially when the job role is more cognitive in nature. So obviously there's a physical component to an HVAC technician or an electrician, but generally they're having to think of, okay, this voltage reading is giving me this. What does that mean for my next step? And when that's the case, VR can really play an important role in teaching the mind, when this happens, do this. When that happens, do that. So I think we're hopeful that at some point maybe some of those hours will count because of that condensed learning. But we're probably still a little ways out from that, I think.
Thank you, Christopher. And Alicia, I want to ask you, not only about your office's work, not in immersive learning, but in future work in general. It's usually these initiatives help a lot, are aim or help to catalyze growth for small and medium businesses, as they usually are the ones who could benefit the most from the cost cut and benefits, or the reduction in turnover, or training risk for the most. But usually these businesses are the less likely to make this significant IT investments, or they lack access to in-house technicians or a cybersecurity strategy. And how do you think we can navigate and hopefully promote the adoption of cutting edge technology by small businesses, and not only with your the recent efforts with immersive learning, but future work at large?
Yeah, thank you. I think so. Just to touch briefly on the Future of Work caucus, the Congresswoman created this caucus in 2020, right as the pandemic was hitting, and it really kind of highlighted the need for the idea that the future of work is now, and that we need to be having these conversations immediately, and should have been having them, for years. And so I think, in terms of the incentivization of businesses, I will defer to the panelists who are, working with businesses directly. But I think there's a set of policy tools that we traditionally use to try and incentivize different actions, whether that's direct financial support or a tax incentive. There's kind of a range of tools, but the policymaking process it doesn't exist in a vacuum or in a silo, and there needs to be feedback from people who are going to be in businesses implementing this, from learners who will use the technology, from the policy or experts on the process of governance. It's a conversation that needs to involve the feedback of everyone who will be impacted and who will be actually doing the work of implementing these policies. So I think that thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Amanda, I want to ask that to you too. How has been your experience, trying to get this businesses that might be smaller businesses that might be a little bit skeptical, the buy-in might not be big. They might see this still as a gimmick, and usually these businesses have limited capital. So making these large investments can present a pretty big risk for them. How have you navigated that?
Yeah, of course. Well, the first thing that I want to say is that writ large is pretty affordable, especially when you start evaluating that ROI. So the cost doesn't seem like the biggest barrier. And Christopher's talked about it. We've all talked about it. But for us, it's really lifting the existing employer partnerships that we already have and really showcasing the efficacy of the programs that we're running across the country. And so, we work with a handful of really strong employers, and they become our ambassadors. And they speak the language, and they can again, the efficacy piece is so important. And we actually have an efficacy team at Transfer that really focuses on ensuring that we are proving that we can reach those outcomes. So whether we're talking about, outcomes sort of girded in policy, or we're talking about employability skills, work-based learning, or, the competencies that employers are actually seeking, we have partners that can stand up and speak on behalf of how transformative this disruptive technology can be. And if you don't mind, I'd like to bring up one point that I think is really powerful, and we've all touched on it a little bit. Virtual reality is appropriate for all learning styles. That hybrid approach to learning is so incredibly powerful. And so whether we're talking about someone who is neurodivergent, right? Whether we're talking about someone who is neurotypical, the value in VR is that it does increase equity. The value of VR is that it does increase access. And again, that confidence piece, regardless of how your brain is structured, can move mountains.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And I wanted to pull another thread you mentioned in the opening question. It's like that informed decision and to increase worker retention. And I think that's a key point of complication for apprenticeship programs in general. It's like sometimes businesses are skeptical of training workers because they might leave, and then the investment they make on training those workers might not present that ROI. And how do you think you can tackle this now with the use of immersive learning, maybe pull in resources together, have like multiple businesses buy into a similar apprenticeship program? How do you think that could help navigate that retention problem?
Of course. We have really aligned with workforce development boards across the United States. We have found that they are the strongest intermediary organizations that we have across the country. They are tied to college systems, they are tied to K through 12 systems, and they are tied to employers. And so when we lean into that nucleus, when we lean into that strong intermediary organization, and actually train their staff on career navigation using VR, train their staff on career exploration using VR, that is where the rubber meets the road. And so in Texas in particular, we have 28 workforce development boards across the state, and we are installed in 18 of them. And we actually align with what they call their career outreach specialist program. The truth is that we have a massive deficit across the United States regarding counseling. We have a massive counselor to student ratio. We have a lack of training when it comes to career counseling, and that transfers all the way up to career navigation for adult learners. And so what we have found is that when we train the trainer and really empower these workforce development boards to do the work, that is the best thing that we can do at Transfer. And so that is the value that we have found. Again, finding those intermediary organizations that exist in these strong ecosystems, using VR so they can travel into their communities, so they can reach out to their employers and speak that language and speak to the regionally specific dialect that really moves the needle. And so then when you align with that strong intermediary organization, you are enabling, that conversation to happen after the immersive experience, which then charges the learner to make the informed decision.
Thank you, Amanda. So Shaylin, I wanted to go back to you and something you mentioned. I think it's key. It's often businesses do not know how to navigate like the new challenges that arrive with modernizing. As you mentioned, if you had a mom and pop shop that was not really like embedded in tech, but then once you digitalize, you're collecting a lot of data, and all of a sudden you have to have a data security strategy and stuff, and this kind of problems that rise with digitalization. How do you think businesses can navigate that? I think you mentioned at one point the MEP network, and I know they've been doing some technical assistance. How do you think like a program or like a policy angle could be to help bridge that knowledge gap, if you want to call it like that?
It's a great question, Juan. I'll give one example of a programmatic idea and one example of maybe a policy solution. In terms of programmatic ideas, I think peer learning is an invaluable resource for business leaders who want to be at the cutting edge. And whether it's leaning into regional trade associations, your local chapter of National Manufacturers Association, or your Chamber of Commerce, or your local bio chapter, right, in the state level, learning from other employers and companies who are also trying to figure out the bleeding edge, I think is a great space. And there are lots of regional and national forums for that to take place. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, in particular, the T3 network, and a number of other initiatives within the Chamber of Commerce Foundation, it's separate from the chamber itself, creates lots of spaces for employers to navigate the future of technology and work and learning. And hats off to Jason's team there for cultivating that space. So I would look to forums to learn in that type of peer learning setting. It's something that we found to be invaluable for community colleges, for universities, for higher ed organizations. Even WIBs, the workforce boards, have their own associations for peer learning. In terms of policy ideas that could help employers and businesses understand this space and navigate, I actually think that there would be a great deal of value in using learning credits to support upskilling of some leaders. There's been a growth of these intermediaries, these education benefit management companies, like Guild Education is a massive one. Lumina Foundation is an investor on them, the largest philanthropic foundation dedicated to education in the country. And much of the efforts of these organizations have been to get uptake on education benefits and upskilling for middle skill workers or early career professionals who are in need of some new skills. But I actually wonder if there might be a market and a potential policy lever to help with some of the education of our business community, because this challenge that we're talking about with AR/VR, we also found when it comes to AI, when it comes to cybersecurity best practices, when it comes to really any part of digital transformation, the large companies that have the wherewithal for self-education and research have it figured out. They're set. But for the vast majority of employers in the country, who are actually small and medium-sized employers, less than 500 employees, there isn't necessarily that wherewithal. And I think there's actually an interesting opportunity for policy to help catalyze intermediaries, as Amanda said, in bringing together some of those. I don't think we should just fund all of the professional development for employers. I don't think that's the right a solution. But I think there's a need to seed the conversations and create some infrastructure so that it could be successful in the long run. So those are some initial ideas that come to mind for me.
Thank you, Shillian. And Alicia, that's something I want to touch on too, and something we've talked about is it's usually this workforce development boards and apprenticeship programs are usually managed at the state level. So from your experience working in this field, how do you think we can integrate a way that respects that autonomy from the states, but also the federal government? We can have nationwide efforts, coordinated efforts to have some level of uniformity in learning. How has the office managed to try to navigate that road? What do you think are the key areas where we can have federal involvement?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big question because all policy is local on some level, and the very specific details matter a great deal when you're implementing policy. So there's certain things that will always be needed to have local and state input and implementation strategies. I think that with a lot of the kind of existing workforce underpinning legislation like WIOA or Perkins, there's a pretty detailed planning that's required to use that funding. There's local and state planning that's involved. So I think, it's a great idea to take a really detailed look at all these plans and see if there's a federal strategy that could come out of that. I mean, there's a lot of thought happening at the federal level about how do we solve this workforce challenge. But I think that taking detailed plans from local and state levels and seeing what we can do to pull out concepts that are really happening in many different localities, and how do we help support these efforts at the federal level is a really important concept.
Thanks, Alicia. And we're coming to close to time, but hopefully we can sneak one last question. And Christopher, something Shailene has mentioned, Amanda too. It's like that role of immersive learning providers and program managers to solve some of those questions that I was asking Shailene about a business that has never implemented this type of technology. What do you say? What have you seen are those key questions that are like, wow, like I didn't even know how to navigate that, and I'm glad this third party providers are able to provide that knowledge. What do you think it's usually the biggest headache a third party provider can resolve for one of these businesses?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think fundamentally it's the way we describe it is the VR headset will usually get the eyeballs at a trade show or get the big line at a career fair, but then you go give a small plumbing business a headset and you say, good luck. That's where the disconnect happens, right? And so I think what we've realized is you've really got to help put structure and parameters around how do you take this cool technology that gets the eyeballs and actually make it practical for your business or for the workforce development organization or the community college. And so we've done a lot of work to really think through, what does that onboarding process look like? What does it look like in the first 90 days, first 180 days? So like I mentioned earlier, I think there's still a little bit of friction in merging these immersive technologies with more traditional learning environments. And so the more we can provide clarity and structure around how to use it, I think, the more rapid the adoption will be.
Yeah, man, and I want to ask that to you too. Like your experience with transfer, like what do you think have been those key challenges and those key things that third party providers can fill in the hole and maybe help catalyze that growth into adoption? Oh, Amanda.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. You
Oh,
cut out for just a second. I apologize. It's
okay.
probably my connection.
Don't worry. Yeah, I just want to extend that question to you too. And like, what do you think? What have you felt as an experience with like being a third party uh,
Yeah.
provider? Like, what do you think have been the biggest challenges, and what has like the biggest problem transfer has had to step in and say, look, we can provide you the expertise, or maybe this is something you haven't implemented before. Let me walk you through it.
Of course. Yeah, very much in line with what Christopher shared. For us, it's about teaching people how to scaffold into their existing programming. So making sure that we have plenty of educators on staff who are those customer success managers and provide those wraparound services. Also providing the service of developing a program from the ground up, ensuring again that we align with the outcomes they're seeking. And so whether they are pulling Perkins money or they're pulling WIOA money, those all align with outcomes. And so in order for us to prove efficacy, that's what we are moving towards. And so we really have to showcase that we are helping teachers on the ground align with their standards. We really have to showcase that we're helping community colleges meet their outcomes, which in turn brings them formula funding to their schools. And so really having those conversations to ensure that we are not throwing headsets at the wall and walking away. I'm sure you recognize that whether you are an employer or an educator, you get told what to do all of the time. And so I feel like it's primal nature to say no. And so we work really hard, to navigate those barriers and to ensure that they understand we are there start to finish and their success is our success. Oh, Juan, you're on mute, I think.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amanda. And I think I was just saying, I think we're coming up to time. So I think that will be wrapping up our conversation for today. Dan, Alicia, Shailene, Christopher, Amanda, I thank you so much for joining us today. For those wishing to revisit this conversation, you will find the full recording on ITIF's YouTube channel. Also, to keep up with ITIF's latest insight into AR, VR, and other tech policy discussions, make sure to follow us on social media. And last, we do have a report on apprenticeship programs in AR/VR that was published essentially a month ago. That anyone interested in the topic, if they want to do a deeper dive, you can go to read. I want to thank you, everyone, and have a good day.